Support comes from Goethe Pop-Up Seattle, presenting 55 Voices for Democracy, a podcast that brings together conversations with intellectuals, artists, and activists. Inspired by Thomas Mann's speeches produced for the BBC during the rise of fascism in Europe. Available on Apple Podcast and Spotify.
Hey, it's Patricia Murphy. It's Thursday, and this is Seattle Now. We're deep in the holidays, and even though we've been warned not to gather, humans are going to do what they do. People are bubbling up with family and friends who live outside their home. In a minute, Alison Drake from UW's Department of Global Health will tell us what it takes to make it work. But first, let's get you caught up. Students could be back in school in the new year. The governor relaxed the rules for school reopenings on a regional basis based on COVID case rates. The new standards prioritize younger students, but middle and even high schoolers could go back if the numbers make sense. Schools will get $3 million in federal funding to plan for safe reopenings. Researchers from the University of Washington Medical Center think they're one step closer to connecting post-COVID dementia to the virus. A new study suggests COVID could affect the brain. Scientists found that the spike protein of the virus enters the brain. That strongly suggests the coronavirus itself penetrates the brain. The study was published in Nature Neuroscience. And if you're a fan of Schitt's Creek, the Emmy Award-winning comedy, you might want to make a trip to Queen Anne. One enterprising Seattleite built a model of the Rosebud Motel in front of his home. Just some holiday cheer. It's a really good imitation, complete with the little planters. If you want to check it out, you could walk down 10th Avenue West, or you could spare his neighbors and check out the photos in the Seattle Times. Millions traveled over the Thanksgiving holiday despite government advice to stay home. It just didn't work to tell people not to gather. So knowing that, how can we handle the upcoming holidays as safely as possible? Alison Drake is an assistant professor in the Department of Global Health at the University of Washington. Thanks for taking the time, Alison.
Yeah, thank you for having me today.
Alison, even with all the guidance, people are really confused. What are some of the things you're hearing that concern you?
I hear a lot of people talk about what they are, quote, just doing. Well, I just did this, or I'm only doing this, or I only gathered with this person, particularly if it's a close friend, if it's a close family member, if there's a perception that that person has the exact same level of risk that you have, which may or may not be true. So really asking, well, if you're going to have your mother-in-law watch your child, who has your mother-in-law been around? You know, has that person been meeting with other people? Has she been wearing masks with other individuals? Is she out in the community? So if your goal is to really treat people as if they are a member of your household, you really need to know their activities in the same intimacy that you would with other people who are outside of your household. And we're just not typically used to having those types of really private conversations and asking people, you know, what have you done? And you have to know what to probe on too. You know, have you ever been anywhere with another person without a mask? And, you know, you can kind of start to have those conversations, and you may need to give examples. You know, when you were out shopping, have you had any friends over? Have you shared a meal with another person? Have you been in a car with another person? And then what about the workplace? So really trying to understand what the other people's risk profile looks like is really important.
We know that shaming people into safe behavior does not work. Telling people no doesn't work. So we need to pivot because of what we know about the reality of human behavior. What can we do to be as safe as possible this Christmas?
There are a lot of people who are going to travel, who are going to gather with others and perhaps not do the quarantine. So I hear this less frequently talked about of, you know, what do we do with people who will make their own choices about how they will live their lives, and can we give them guidance to not follow a quarantine but do the things that are as safe as possible, which might be more like a modified quarantine where you're really limiting your interactions as much as possible. Limit those essential errands, you know, to as few trips as you can make. Limit your social circles to as small as you can. And then everyone that you gather with, try to get them all to follow the same rules that you're applying. A way to minimize your risks of getting and transmitting COVID-19 over the holidays. And if you are going to gather, to recommend a 14-day quarantine. The longer you quarantine, the better. There is some local guidance from CDC as well as from King County specifically that talks about, well, if you can't do 14 days, 10 days is pretty good. And then if that's not possible, another alternative is to quarantine for 7 days and then get a COVID test. And if that's negative, then you are, quote, cleared for, your gathering that day.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up testing because a lot of people are using testing to feel like they're gathering safely. But we have read the news stories. Not all tests are the same. Is this just another false sense of security? What should we understand about testing?
Testing can be good for that single day event. So if you get a COVID test, and that's really following the public health guidance of if you have a test in the prior 1 or 2 days before, maybe up to 3 days, that test may be helpful in helping you make a decision about gathering for a one-day event. It doesn't necessarily say anything about the next day. So, all you know is that you're negative on that day. That's why the recommendations to quarantine with a test is really optimal, because you're thinking about, well, how long has it been since I have interacted with another person in close contact and had a, quote, exposure? And that negative test means more when it's coupled with the quarantine rather than just an individual test.
We're starting to vaccinate people here in Washington state, which is so hopeful, right? Will seeing vaccinations potentially change people's behavior? How might that impact the way we think about risk?
Right. So I think that you're right. As people start to feel like, well, the vaccine is here, it's less risky to go out in the world, that there might be a false sense of security for individuals who might feel like they don't have to take as many precautions as they were before. And then there's another group in the community who is what we call vaccine hesitant or maybe adverse to getting a vaccine, and the messaging and a lot of the public figures who have plans to vaccinate certain individuals publicly to show that it's safe. And we'll have to see whether that messaging is convincing to people, whether they feel like it's safe. But there is a lot of distrust with public health, I think, right now, based on the way that we handled the COVID-19 pandemic, at the national level, and the way that individual government agencies were really tasked with making up the rules as they went along for themselves in the absence of that national leadership.
We've been talking a lot about state regulations and what's allowed versus what might be a risk assessment for someone. And I think between those two things, it seems like some of the most dangerous situations might be some of the most tempting. The whole family gathered around, unwrapping presents. Maybe people are drinking. What's the best way to navigate these situations where best laid plans and then halfway through things start to change a little bit? Emotions start to come into play.
Yeah, I think if you are trying to find this safety plan to gather with other people, you have to make a determination whether, one, you are comfortable gathering at all. And some people say, I don't think we should gather. We should follow the rules. Other people might say, let's try the quarantine and let's try this. So you kind of need to have a plan A, B, C, and maybe D. So anything can happen at any moment. And some of the things that I have seen from outbreak investigations is that people are often uncomfortable with telling anyone that they have symptoms, or that they just don't tell anyone. So you have a mild symptom. Maybe it's an embarrassing symptom like diarrhea, and you don't want to tell anyone that you're having that. An early symptom that progresses later on, and a few days later that person has COVID, and then you come back and say, oh, when we gathered, actually I was sick, I didn't say anything. People who have symptoms should bow out of gathering with other people in their household, and people who have pending COVID tests also, those are people that are quite dangerous to gather with. And you have to be willing to make a game day decision and say, something has changed, it's not safe to gather. Or to be honest, if you break the, quote, rules of the pod and you did something that is outside of what you've already agreed to, it's not fair to the people in the pod, and that breaks trust. And sometimes it's out of your control. Maybe it wasn't something that you anticipated. It's not about whether someone is good or bad. It just says, hey, something's changed. And from the symptoms, maybe you don't even want to tell people what your symptoms are. You just say, I'm not feeling well. I don't think it's a good idea to gather. And that conversation really needs to be, again, just really, really honest in order to protect everyone.
Alison, what are your plans for the holidays?
We have formed a pod with our family. It's taken us time to get there. We were doing outdoor social distance masked activities until we all cleared our quarantine period. So now we will gather with our immediate family in Michigan for the holidays. But it took many, many hours of conversations and adjustments, and we are always prepared to go back to our plan B of saying we're going to stay home if anything changes, anyone becomes ill, or if their exposures change.
Yeah. Stay flexible, stay safe this holiday season. And most importantly, the message is probably just keep to your household. Alison Drake is an assistant professor in the Department of Global Health at the University of Washington. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for your insight.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for listening to Seattle Now. The show is produced by Sophie Reed, Clare McGrane, Caroline Chamberlain Gomez, and Jason Pagano. Matt Jorgensen does our music. I'm Patricia Murphy. See you tomorrow. As this memorable year comes to an end, it's good to know we got through it together. KUOW has been able to bring you programming that broadens your perspective, thanks to our members who step up to support this work. If KUOW has been there for you at some point in the past year, consider making a financial gift to ensure a new year of telling important stories about our community. Use the link in our description to make your gift today. And thanks.